Good morning. This lecture video is going to look specifically at the role ATP plays during the power stroke or cross-bridge cycling in the sliding filament model of muscle contraction. So in the last couple lecture videos, we talked about the skeletal anatomy, muscle fiber anatomy, and we talked about the sliding filament model and how those actin and myosins interact with each other in order to produce or shorten the length of that muscle fiber. So in this video, we're going to look specifically at the role ATP plays in that and two other compounds, ADP and inorganic phosphate. Remember that when ADP and phosphate are combined to make ATP, we are storing energy. When ATP gets released into ADP and phosphate, we are releasing energy. So for the thin filament to continue to slide, here's our thick filament, here's our thin filament in the diagram. So when for the thin filament to continue to slide past that thick filament during the muscle contraction, the myosin's head must pull the actin at the binding site, so it's going to bind, then it needs to pull it, then it needs to detach or release itself, reposition or recock itself, attach to the binding site again, pull, detach, reposition, pull, detach, and continue the cycle over and over again. And this repeated unit is called cross-bridge cycling or the cross-bridge cycle. When you think about this, the best analogy is to compare this to if you are rowing a boat with an oar, okay? When you are rowing the boat, the paddle of the oars, which would be the myosin heads, pull, pushing the boat forward. You lift it from the water, so that would be the detachment stage here. Reposition your oar, right? Pull it back again before you put it back in the order to do that stroke motion again to go even further. So myosin and actin act very similar to like rowing a boat, this mechanism. Each of these cycles requires energy, and the actin and the myosin heads in the sarcomere repeatedly pulling on that thin filament also requires energy, and all of that energy is provided by ATP. So if you're looking at the diagram here, here's how this works. Cross-bridge formation occurs when the myosin head, here's the myosin head, attaches to the actin while ADP and inorganic phosphate are still bound to the myosin. So the myosin is going to attach itself and it's going to have ADP and phosphate, inorganic phosphate attached to it as well. The ADP and the inorganic phosphate will then be released, and this is going to cause myosin here to form a stronger attachment to the actin. And once it forms that attachment, the myosin head will actually move towards the M line, pulling the actin along with it. And this is called the power stroke, right? So ADP and phosphate are going to be released. They're going to go out here and they're actually going to end up rejoining together to form ATP. But once they're released, this myosin head is going to power stroke. Think about that oar, moving that oar, stroking that oar forward, pulling the actin towards the M line or towards the center of the sarcomere. Then that ATP that's going to be made out here is going to attach itself, reattach itself to this myosin head. And when it attaches itself to the myosin head, it actually allows the myosin head to detach itself from the actin. So it'd be like taking the oar out of the water. If there's no ATP present, this myosin head cannot release that actin. And so ATP attaches. This is going to cause the myosin head to detach from the actin. The ATP will then end up being released. ADP and inorganic phosphate then are going to come back in, join to the myosin head, and the myosin head will reposition itself, or what we call recocking itself, in order to get ready to bind back to the actin and do the power stroke again. So we started with ADP and phosphate. It will get released during the power stroke. It will go out and it'll make ATP, That ATP is going to come back in, bind to the head, causing it to release itself from the actin. It will reposition itself or recock itself, in which case the ATP will use energy to do that, and then it will be converted back into ADP, an inorganic phosphate, which will join to the myosin head up here, allowing that myosin head to then reattach to the actin and continue this cycle again. Not only is ATP used for this power stroke, this physical activity, but it's also used for moving calcium in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which we talked about also in terms of allowing that action potential to continue through. When the myosin head is cocked, myosin is said to be in a high energy conformation. So the energy that is expended as the myosin head moves through the power stroke, and at the end of the power stroke, okay, once that power stroke is done, then the myosin head is in a low energy position, which would make sense, right? You have this myosin head that's getting ready to do this activity. It's got lots of energy available to it, but then once it does the activity, then it's going to have less energy because energy is being used. So the question now is, where do we get this ATP from? We have to supply the cell with ATP in order for it to give up phosphates to become ADP, an inorganic phosphate, and to allow those two to join together to form ATP. So where do we get the sources of ATP from? Well, the amount of ATP that's actually stored in our muscles is really low, and actually only a few seconds worth of muscle contractions is going to be stored within your muscles. So we have to generate ATP. As it is broken down during the power stroke cycling or during the cross-bridge cycling, ATP must be regenerated and replaced quickly to allow for sustained contraction, right? Typically, the activities we need are longer than just a few seconds worth of activity. And there are three mechanisms at which ATP can be regenerated: creatine phosphate metabolism, anaerobic glycolysis, and then fermentation and aerobic respiration. So in creatine phosphate, creatine phosphate is a molecule that can store energy in its phosphate bonds, so very similar to ATP. In a resting muscle, excess ATP transfers its energy to creatine, producing ADP and creatine phosphate. This actually acts as an energy reserve that can be used to quickly create more ATP. When the muscle starts to contract and needs energy, creatine phosphate transfers its phosphate back to ADP to form ATP and creatine. And this reaction is going to actually be sped up or catalyzed by an enzyme called creatine kinase. And it occurs really, really quickly. Creatine phosphate-derived ATP can power the first few seconds of muscle contraction. However, creatine phosphate can only provide approximately 15 seconds worth of energy, at which point another energy source will have to be used. So if you're a sprinter running the Olympic 100-yard dash, you're probably going to be using a lot of creatine phosphate to supply you with energy, because you're going to be doing that for less than 15 seconds. I should say 15 seconds worth of energy, not 15 minutes. My bad. Oh, there's also another typo on there too, but 15 seconds worth of energy. The second way that ATP can be produced is glycolysis. Glycolysis is a non-oxygen dependent, so we call it anaerobic process, that breaks down glucose or sugar to produce ATP. However, glycolysis cannot generate ATP as quickly as creatine phosphate. So the switch to glycolysis results in a much slower rate of ATP availability to the muscle. The sugar that's used in glycolysis can be provided by blood glucose or by breaking down glycogen that is stored in the muscle. The breakdown of one glucose molecule produces 2 ATP and 2 molecules of something called pyruvic acid. Pyruvic acid can be used in aerobic respiration, or if there's oxygen present. So pyruvic acid can be used in aerobic in aerobic respiration in the presence of oxygen. But if oxygen is not available, it ends up getting converted to lactic acid, and this is what causes your muscles to ache. So basically, when you have sore muscles after an activity, your ATP that was generated, there wasn't enough oxygen in order to continue glycolysis, and so that ends up going into a lactic acid, which builds up in your muscle and causes your muscles to be sore. And lastly, aerobic respiration is the breakdown of glucose in the presence of oxygen to make ATP. Approximately 95% of the ATP required for resting or moderately active muscles is provided by aerobic respiration. And all of this is going to take place in the mitochondria of your cell, those power plants. The inputs for aerobic respiration include glucose circulating in the bloodstream, the pyruvic acid that was made in this step up here in glycolysis, and then some fatty acids. Aerobic respiration is much more efficient than anaerobic glycolysis. It produces about 36 ATP per molecule of glucose versus the 4 that we actually got from glycolysis, actually only 2. So it's a much better way to generate a lot of ATP. However, the issue is that it cannot be sustained without a steady supply of oxygen to the muscle, skeletal muscle, and it is a much slower process than either of the other two options. Muscle fatigue then occurs when a muscle can no longer contract in response to signals from the nervous system. So we don't really know exactly all of the physiology behind muscle fatigue, but we do know that there are certain factors that are involved with decreased muscle contractions that occur during fatigue. One of them is the amount of ATP that is available. If ATP is needed for normal muscle contraction, and as ATP reserves are reduced, muscle function may decline. This is probably more of a factor in brief, intense muscle output rather than sustained lower intensity efforts, but long periods of sustained exercise may actually damage the sarcoplasmic reticulum and the sarcolemma, and that might actually limit the amount of calcium that is available, which would also lead to muscle fatigue. So ATP and calcium, the amounts of both of those are going to play a role in muscle fatigue. Also, the amount of oxygen that is present, because oxygen is required to restore ATP and creatine phosphate levels. So without that oxygen, then long-term muscle activity cannot be sustained. So that is the role ATP plays in your muscle contractions.